going to tell you about the worst dictatorship you've never heard of. And I need you to understand something. Before we begin, what I'm about to describe is so brutal, so irrational, so completely horrific that your first instinct will be to think I'm exaggerating. I'm not. This is Equatorial Guinea, a tiny country on the west coast of Central Africa. If you're looking at a map right now, trying to find it, you're probably not alone. Most people couldn't point it out if their life depended on it. It's small, really small, about the size of Massachusetts. When our story begins in 1968, the population was around 300,000 people. That's roughly the population of Windhoek, or one medium-sized city. Between 1968 and 1979, 11 years, a third of that population either died or fled the country. One third, 100,000 people, dead or in exile, from a population of 300,000. Imagine if tomorrow, 1 out of 3 people you knew or you know was just gone, dead or fled. That's what exactly happened in Equatorial Guinea. This is the man who did it, Francisco Macías Nguema, the first president of Equatorial Guinea, a man who banned the word intellectual, a man who outlawed fishing in certain areas and the use of lubricating oil because he thought mechanics were sabotaging vehicles, a man who forced prisoners to dig their own graves while a band played "Those Were the Days" by Mary Hopkins. Yes, those were the days. That cheerful 1960 pop song about nostalgia and friendship, playing while people dug their own graves. A man who killed so many people, dumped so many bodies in the ocean that the fishing industry collapsed. Not because of overfishing, but because the waters around Malabo, the capital, were contaminated with corpses. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. Most people have absolutely no idea that this happened. You know about Idi Amin. You know about Mobutu. If you've been watching this series, you definitely know about them now. But Francisco Macías Nguema, the man who killed a third of his population, who closed every school in the country, who made his personal residence the only place with electricity, nobody talks about him. He's the forgotten monster. So why don't we know about him? Why has these atrocities been erased from public memory? And more importantly, what does Equatorial Guinea's nightmare teach Kenya about what happens when anti-intellectualism meets absolute power? Those are the questions we are answering today. Because this isn't just history, this is a warning about what happens when you let someone who hates educated people run a country. And in case you haven't noticed, there's a lot of anti-intellectual rhetoric floating around East Africa. And a lot of politicians that are not pro-education or who've scammed their way through forged papers to get into power. Let's start at the beginning, because understanding how monsters are made might help us prevent the next one. Francisco Macías Nguema was born on January 1st, 1924, or possibly 1922. Sources differ, which would tell you something about record keeping in a colonial Spanish Guinea. In Nisengoyong, in what is now Equatorial Guinea, Spain's forgotten colonies. While Britain and France had dozens of colonies and at least pretended to prepare them for independence, Spain had very few and did virtually nothing. Spanish Guinea was poor, neglected, barely developed, and brutally oppressed. The Spanish colonial authorities were, by most accounts, particularly cruel, even by colonial standards, which says so much to what happened to Equatorial Guinea. And this is where Francisco Macías Nguema's story begins, with trauma. His father was murdered by Spanish colonial administrators. Different accounts give different reasons. Some say he refused forced labor. Others say he challenged colonial authority in some way. Doesn't matter. The Spanish killed him. Francisco was young then when this happened. He watched, or at least knew, that the colonial power murdered his father. His mother committed suicide shortly after. Couldn't cope with the grief, with the trauma, with raising children alone in a colonial system designed to crush people. So, young Francisco Macías Nguema was orphaned, raised by relatives, growing up in extreme poverty in one of Spain's most neglected colonies, with the knowledge that colonizers murdered his father and destroyed his family. His brother committed suicide later. Macías himself attempted suicide as a young man too, according to multiple sources. Now, I need to be very, very clear about something. None of this excuses what he did. Trauma doesn't justify genocide. Millions of people experience horrific childhoods and do not grow up to murder 50,000 people. But understanding how broken this man was, how psychologically damaged from the beginning, helps us understand the absolutely irrational horror that followed. Because Macías wasn't just evil. He was genuinely, clinically insane. Despite, or perhaps because of his traumatic childhood, Macías pursued education as far as it was available to Africans in Spanish Guinea, which wasn't very far. He only reached fourth grade. That's about age 10 in most systems. And in Kenya, we know one or two people that at best they got, or rumor has it, they got to fourth grade. And they're in politics as members of parliament. But he was literate, which put him ahead of most people in Spanish Guinea at that time. And he was smart, cunning, really good at reading people, good at manipulation. He got a job as a court interpreter. This is crucial. As a court interpreter, he had power. He could influence trials. He could make defendants sound guilty or innocent based on how he translated. And according to multiple historical accounts, he absolutely abused his power. He took bribes to manipulate the translations, money from defendants to make them sound innocent, money from accusers to make defendants sound guilty. The Spanish colonial administrators noticed that he was effective, but they misread the situation. They thought his success in trials showed leadership ability and influence. They didn't realize or didn't care that he was just corrupt and manipulative. So they promoted him. And promoted him rapidly. Just a few years in the 1960s, he went from court interpreter to assistant interpreter, mayor of Mongomo, his hometown, minister of public works, deputy president of the governing council. From fourth grade education to deputy president in a few years. But even during this rise, there were signs. Massive red flags that should have stopped him. In 1968, there was a conference in Madrid to discuss Equatorial Guinea's upcoming independence. Macías was there as a delegate. During one session, he suddenly, completely out of nowhere, launched into what witnesses described as an incoherent eulogy of the Nazis. He started praising Adolf Hitler, said Hitler wanted to save Africans from colonialism but got confused, and he tried to conquer Europe instead. The room went silent. Spanish officials were shocked. Other Equatorial Guinean delegates were embarrassed, but nothing happened. No psychological evaluation, no removal from the delegation, nothing, because independence was coming whether Spain liked it or not. And they needed anyone to hand power to. And on October 12, 1968, Equatorial Guinea gained independence from Spain. Elections were held. Multiple candidates ran. There was genuine political competition, genuine hope. Francisco Macías Nguema emerged victorious, not by a huge margin, not unopposed. He won because he campaigned well, because he promised change, because people saw him as someone who stood up to the Spanish colonialism or colonialists. When he took office, people celebrated. Finally, they thought we were free. We can build our own future. We can develop our country. They had no idea they just elected a man who'd kill a third of them within a decade. Spain promised aid. They said they would help with the transition, provide technical support, and keep economic ties strong. That lasted about 3 months. And by early 1969, just a few months after independence, educated Equatorial Guineans were fleeing the country. Why? Because Macías had started arresting people. Anyone with education, anyone who questioned him, anyone who looked at him wrong. One foreign minister, Atanasio Ndongo Mione, who'd been one of the most prominent independence leaders, arrested on treason charges, then murdered. It was stated, thrown out of a window. And here is where it gets even more disturbing. Macías took photographs of Ndongo dying on the streets. He then showed these photographs to foreign journalists like trophies. Other cabinet ministers and cabinet members fled or were killed. His own brother-in-law fled the country. Spanish technicians and advisors, the ones who were supposed to help with the transition, they fled too or were expelled. And within a year of independence, schools were closing because teachers had fled or had been arrested. Hospitals were closing because doctors had fled or had been arrested. The few functioning institutions that Spanish colonialism had left behind, and there weren't many by the way, collapsed within months. Think about that timeline. October 1968, independence, celebration, hope. Early 1969, cabinet members are being murdered, educated people fleeing, institutions collapsing. 1 year. That's all it took for the nightmare to begin. Anti-intellectualism in politics isn't just populism. It's a red flag for totalitarianism. When leaders mock education, expertise, scientists, doctors, professors, or elites in general, they are often preparing to eliminate anyone who thinks or can think critically. Pay attention to that rhetoric. Stop it before it actually escalates. Because you see, in 1969, there was a coup attempt. Or at least, Macías claimed that there was a coup attempt. Whether it was real or imagined, nobody knows for sure. It didn't matter. Macías used it as an excuse. He purged the government, purged the military. He arrested anyone he suspected of disloyalty, which is was basically anyone with education or ambition or an independent thought. And he created Black Beach Prison. Black Beach. In Malabo, in the capital, officially a prison, actually a torture chamber and an execution site. People were thrown into cells without trials. Many simply disappeared. Families never saw them again. The few lucky ones, if you can call them lucky, were eventually released, often after years. They described horror, torture, starvation, disease, death. And by 1970, 2 years after the independence, Equatorial Guinea was a one-party state under Macías' absolute control. Political parties banned, elections a joke, constitution suspended, opposition in prison, in exile, or dead. And the educated class, the doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, they were fleeing in massive numbers to Gabon, to Cameroon, to Spain, anywhere they could go. The economy, which was never strong to begin with, cratered. Cocoa production, the country's main export, virtually the only source of foreign currency, fell by 90%. Imagine 90% in just a few years. Why? Because the plantation workers who knew how to cultivate cocoa had either fled, been killed, or were too terrified to work properly. Without cocoa exports, there was no foreign currency. Without foreign currency, there was no imports. And without imports, there was no fuel, no medicine, no spare parts for machinery, or nothing. And Macías, he kept giving speeches, increasingly bizarre, increasingly paranoid speeches. He started declaring himself things like unique miracle and Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture. Grand Master of Education, from a man who'd closed all the schools. But we haven't even gotten to the truly crazy part yet. By 1975, Equatorial Guinea had become something almost unique in African history. A hermit state, like North Korea. But somehow worse. No foreign journalists were allowed in, no international observers. The Spanish embassy closed. Most other embassies closed. Even the Soviet Union and China, who usually loved supporting African socialist states, who were competing for influence during the World War II, they wanted nothing to do with Macías. Think about that. The Soviet and the Chinese, who backed some pretty brutal regimes, looked at Macías and said, hey, no, this guy is too unstable. So what we know about this period comes mostly from refugees who escaped and the few foreign witnesses who got out. And what they describe is genuinely nightmarish. Let me talk you through what Equatorial Guinea became under Macías. That, I am warning you, some of this is deeply disturbing. Macías became obsessed with witchcraft and traditional religion. Not in a cultural pride way, in a paranoid, superstitious, genuinely delusional way. He consulted witch doctors before making major decisions, political decisions, military decisions, actually everything. He kept human skulls in his office on display like decorations. Multiple witnesses who saw his office, government officials, foreign visitors who met with him in the early years before total isolation, they all described seeing human skulls. And then there were the reports about cannibalism. Now, I need to be extremely careful here. Cannibalism accusations have historically been weaponized against Africans. Colonial powers use these accusations to dehumanize people and to justify oppression. So I'm not going to throw this claim around lightly. But in this case, the evidence is substantial and comes from multiple independent sources. Refugee testimonies from people who worked in government, reports from Nigerian workers who fled the country, testimony at Macías' 1979 trial after his overthrow, accounts from his own presidential guards, reports from the few Spanish nationals who remained in the States. These sources all describe the same things. Macías and members of his inner circle practiced ritual cannibalism, specifically consuming parts of executed prisoners, believing it gave them power over their enemies. Whether Macías personally participated or just allowed his guards to do it, we can't say with absolute certainty. The evidence, though, suggests that he did participate. But regardless, even if he just allowed it, even if he just kept body parts in freezers, this is a level of horror that's insanely hard to process. Let me tell you more about Black Beach Prison. Because it encapsulates how deliberately, theatrically sadistic Macías' regime became. Prisoners were kept in underground cells, often standing in water. Rats everywhere, no sanitation, disease rampant. They were starved systematically, not just given little food, actually starved as a form of torture and eventual execution. What prisoners called, and get it from me, sad, what prisoners actually called the diet. Many died from disease, from starvation, from beatings. But the executions, the actual formal executions, that's where the true horror shows itself. When prisoners were going to be executed, guards would force them to dig their own graves. And while they excavated the earth that would cover their bodies, a band played, an actual band with instruments. And the song they played was "Those Were the Days" by Mary Bukin. That cheerful melody. Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. Think about that. A cheerful pop song about nostalgia and friendship and better times, playing while human beings dig their own graves. That's not just evil. That's theatrical, sadistic, deliberately designed evil. That's someone who wants their victims to experience maximum psychological torture before their deaths. Between 1968 and 1979, Macías killed an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 people out of a population of about 300,000. That's about 1/6 and 1/4 of the entire population. For context, if that happened in Kenya, it would be about 9 to 12 million people dead. 9 to 12 million people dead. The methods varied. Mass executions at Black Beach and other prisons drowning. People tied together and thrown into the oceans. Beatings in public squares. Starvation in detentions. Hangings. It's like watching 1,000 Ways to Die. And some executions happened in football stadium. Macías would order executions in the Malabo Stadium. He'd force the population to attend. Not optional. Mandatory. You had to go and watch. Talk about the gladiator days. Feels like a scene from back in those days when slaves were put against one another. But this time, these are citizens of your own country being forced to watch executions of people they deemed against the regime. And imagine you had to cheer. You had to chant supportive slogans. If you didn't cheer loudly enough, you might be next. Imagine being forced to watch your neighbor, your colleague, maybe your family member being executed and having to applaud, having to cheer, knowing that if you show any sympathy, any horror, any human emotion, then you're next. Forced public displays of loyalty, whether mandatory rallies, compulsory social media support, obligatory praise of leaders. These are the tools of totalitarian control. When political participation becomes compulsory rather than voluntary, when you're punished for not showing enthusiasm, democracy is already dead. And it's a very short path from forced applause to forced witnessing of violence. But you see, we haven't covered the policy that in some ways was even more destructive long term. You see, in 1979, Francisco Macías Nguema closed all schools. Not some, not schools in certain regions, not schools that were problematic. All schools, every single one. Primary schools, secondary schools, the university, every educational institution in the country closed. His reasoning? Schools were breeding grounds for subversion and intellectual thought. My guy, the absurdity, the horror. Think about it. Think about what that means. An entire generation of Equatorial Guinea children grew up without any form of education. No reading, no writing, no mathematics, science, history, nothing. This wasn't just murder of individuals. This was murder of the country's future. Because those children who grew up without education, many of them are adults now in their 50s. They never learned to read. They never got those foundational years back. You can't just restart education for a whole generation a decade later. The damage is permanent. Equatorial Guinea literacy rate, which was already low under Spanish colonial rule, maybe 15 to 20%, plummeted even further. And by 1979, it was estimated that less than 10% of the population could actually read. Oh, and Macías didn't just close schools. He banned, say it with me, he banned the word intellectual. It became illegal to even say the word. If you were called an intellectual, that was essentially a death sentence. You were marked as an enemy of the state. So Macías systematically killed or drove into exile teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, anyone who'd been to university, anyone who'd traveled abroad, anyone who'd read any books, anyone who'd seemed too smart. Kenya, pay very close attention to this pattern. When leaders start attacking expertise, when they mock education, when they dismiss scientists and intellectuals as elites who do not understand real people, that's the beginning of what Macías did. When our parliaments or house of law starts to evolve and you start finding that the people that you continue to elect are deviating from the intellectual paths, and you're getting, those ones, populace and serial lovable human beings that just want to be loved, not because they have any credibility or they bring anything worthwhile or intellectual on the table. Be very wary of it. It starts with rhetoric. It ends with closed schools and murdered professors. Macías also targeted the Catholic Church, which in Equatorial Guinea served not just as a religious function, but also ran schools and hospitals. Priests were arrested. Some disappeared, presumably killed. Churches were closed or converted into warehouses. Religious education was banned. The Bishop of Bata, a prominent religious leader, was arrested and disappeared. Almost certainly murdered. This wasn't anti-colonialism, nationalism, like what we saw with some other African leaders pushing back against missionary influence. This was paranoid authoritarianism, destroying every single institution that wasn't directly under Macías' personal control. By 1976, Equatorial Guinea's economy had essentially ceased to exist. There was no functioning currency. People used barter. There were no imports. You couldn't buy anything that wasn't locally produced. The cocoa plantations, which had been the entire economy, were abandoned. What little infrastructure existed was crumbling. The few paved roads deteriorated. Electricity became sporadic, then mostly disappeared except in Macías' compounds. Clean water systems broke down. People were starving. Not because of drought, not because of a natural disaster, because the government had destroyed the economy so thoroughly that the food couldn't be produced or distributed. And through all this, Macías lived in his presidential compound, increasingly paranoid, increasingly isolated, increasingly delusional, making bizarre decisions, seeing plots everywhere. He didn't trust the military, which fair enough, they tried to coup him, so he kept them deliberately weak and divided. Instead, he armed his personal militia, composed mostly of youth from his Esagoni clan, often teenagers, some even younger. He gave children guns and told them they were protectors of the revolution. They became roaming death squads, extorting, raping, killing with complete impunity, because they were Macías' personal force, loyal only to him. By 1977, about 100,000 people A third of the population had fled to Gabon, Cameroon, to Spain, to Nigeria, anywhere they could go or could let go. Some villages in border regions were completely empty. Everyone had fled, and trying to leave was incredibly dangerous. If you were caught attempting to flee, you were arrested as a traitor. Many were executed. That's modern day North Korea, perhaps. Remember, this is happening in Africa, something that we've never, ever heard of or been taught about. When professionals, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens flee in massive numbers, that's not brain drain. It's a referendum on governance. If people are willing to risk death to leave, ask yourself what they are fleeing from. And if your government is preventing people from leaving, if exodus itself becomes a crime, that's one of the clearest signs of a totalitarian government. Let's just pause, because it makes me think about this. If, like in Kenya, if everyone and the government included are trying to chase people away from the country because they're not able to produce systems that work for our own citizens, and they're trying to make them leave and go to other nations to work for other foreign countries, if that's your policy, it leaves a lot to be desired. And you know what the international community did about all this? Almost nothing. A few human rights organizations tried to raise awareness. Amnesty International documented abuses. Some Spanish politicians expressed concern. But there was no intervention, no sanctions, no international pressure. Why? Because Equatorial Guinea was small, remote, and had no strategic value. There was no oil yet. That wouldn't be discovered until the 90s. There was no major Western interests. It wasn't on any major trade routes. Neither superpower in the Cold War particularly cared. So Macías was free to brutalize his population without international pressure or intervention. This is the horrifying truth about international relations. Small countries without resource can be destroyed, and the world still or simply shrugs and looks away. In 1979, even Macías' inner circle had had enough. His nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema, Basongo, remember that name because he is still in power today, was a military officer and one of the few people Macías still somewhat trusted. Obiang could see that the country was completely collapsing, that Macías' paranoia was turning on everyone, including family members. And Obiang calculated correctly that if he didn't move soon, he'd be next. So on the 3rd of August 1979, Obiang launched a military coup, and he had support from Moroccan troops and backing from Spain and France. The Spanish were eager to end the nightmare they'd partly created by granting independence with zero preparation. There was minimal resistance. Macías' guards, realizing they were on the losing sides, largely surrendered. The population didn't rise up to defend Macías. Why? Why would they? He'd murdered their families, closed their schools, destroyed their economy. Macías fled to the jungle near his home village. And here's the detail that perfectly captures his venality. He took the country's entire financial reserves with him. About $105 million in cash, in suitcases. The entire national treasury in suitcases running through the jungle. If that's not absurd, I don't know what would describe absurd as. 2 weeks later, Obiang's forces found him, hiding in a hut, surrounded by suitcases of stolen money. They arrested him and brought him to Malabo for trial. You can't make this shit up. In September 1979, Francisco Macías Nguema was put on trial. Not in a courtroom. There was no functioning courthouse. In a cinema in Malabo. He was charged with genocide, mass murder, embezzlement, illegal detention, treason. The trial was chaotic. Macías, representing himself, alternated between granting defenses and claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. He denied nothing. He just insisted that he was justified in everything. Witnesses testified about the horrors, about Black Beach Prison, about the executions to music, about bodies in the oceans, about children growing up without schools, about the systemic and systematic destruction of a nation. One witness described how Macías ordered guards to kill prisoners by beating them to death because bullets were too expensive. Another described prisoners were being buried alive. Another testified about finding bodies in the waters around Malabo. Macías' defense, if you can call it that, was basically, I was like a father disciplining his children. Any deaths were unfortunate accidents. 50,000 to 80,000 unfortunate accidents. Wow. And on September 29th, 1979, less than 2 months after his overthrow, Francisco Macías Nguema was found guilty of all counts. The sentence was death. The execution was scheduled for the same day as the verdict, but there was a problem. No Equatorial Guinea soldier would volunteer to be on the firing squad. What? Believe that Macías' spirit would curse anyone who killed him. That they and their families would suffer for it. This is how deeply the fear penetrated. Even after his overthrow, even after his conviction, and even with him in chains about to die, soldiers were terrified of him. Eventually, Moroccan troops who helped with the coup carried out the execution. Francisco Macías Nguema was executed by firing squad on September 29th, 1979. And funny part, he refused a blindfold. And with that, 11 years of absolute horror had come to an end. But here's the tragic, infuriating coda to this story. Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basango, the nephew of the overthrown Macías, is still in power to date. Let that sink in. That coup was 45 years ago. Obiang has been president for Equatorial Guinea for 45 years. He's currently Africa's longest serving dictator. He promised democracy. He promised reconstruction. He promised reconciliation. He promised never again. But instead, he became another dictator. Less insane than his uncle, but still authoritarian, still corrupt, still brutal. And then in the 90s, massive oil reserves were discovered off Equatorial Guinea's coast. Suddenly, this poor, traumatized country was swimming in money, billions of dollars in oil revenue. Did that money go to rebuilding, to educating the generation that grew up without schools, to infrastructure, or to healthcare? No. The Obiang family became fabulously, obscenely wealthy. His son, Teodrin Obiang, bought a $30 million mansion in Malibu, California, a $38.5 million private jet, a fleet of luxury cars worth over $30 million. Michael Jackson's white glove from Thriller. For how much? For $275,000. Meanwhile, 76% of Equatorial Guineans live below the poverty line. Life expectancy is 59 years. Most people lack access to clean water. Equatorial Guinea escaped one dictator only to get another one. The nightmare ended, but the dictatorship didn't. So why don't we talk about Francisco Macías Nguema? Why isn't he as famous or infamous as Idi Amin or Mobutu Sese Seko? Why has this genocide been largely erased from public memory? Let me give you several reasons. And they are all uncomfortable. Number one, size matters in international attention. Uganda is big. Zaire or the Republic of Congo is huge. They matter geopolitically. They have large populations. They are strategically important. Equatorial Guinea, tiny. In 1979, it only had 300,000 people. That's like a middle or medium-sized city. Sad truth, the international community and international media pays attention based on strategic importance, not moral urgency. 1 million people dead in Congo, major headlines. 50,000 dead in Equatorial Guinea, barely a mention. Reason 2, timing. Macías' worst atrocities happened in the mid-70s. What else was happening in the mid-70s? It was the end of the Vietnam War, Watergate, the oil crisis, the Cold War detonate, multiple other African crises. International attention was focused everywhere. A small African country imploding. Come on. Not a priority. Sadly, Macías deliberately isolated the country. No foreign journalists were allowed in. No international observers, no diplomatic presence. The few Spanish nationals who remained couldn't even report freely. The information that got out came from refugees, and refugees from small African countries don't make international headlines. By the time the full horror became clear, after Macías was already overthrown in 1979, it was old news. 4th, post-colonial guilt and narrative complexity. And this is uncomfortable, but it needs to be said. Macías' regime was so bizarre, so seemingly irrational, so characterized by superstition and by anti-intellectualism that it fit perfectly into racist stereotypes about African governance. The heart of darkness narrative, the savage dictators, all the racist tropes that progressive historians and journalists have spent decades trying to dismantle. So there was and is a reluctance to highlight Macías because his story plays into exactly those stereotypes. But here's the thing, ignoring atrocities because they're inconvenient to your narrative is morally bankrupt. The 50,000 to 80,000 dead deserve to be remembered. Even if their story is uncomfortable, even if it doesn't fit neatly into anti-colonialism historiography. Because here's what actually happened. Colonial powers, in this case Spain, left a country completely unprepared for independence. No education system, no trained civil servants, no institutional foundations. Then they walked away and let it burn. Macías was a monster. But he was a monster created in part by the colonial brutality and post-colonial abandonment. Both things can be true. When Macías ruled, Equatorial Guinea had no oil, no strategic resources, nothing the West wanted badly enough to pay attention to. By the time oil was discovered in the 1990s, Macías was long gone and Obiang had cleaned up the country's image just enough to do business with them. Cynical. Yeah, but true. Today is a diaspora of Equatorial Guineans scattered across Spain, Gabon, Cameroon, and other countries. Many are children or grandchildren of refugees from Macías' era. They remember, they tell their stories, they maintain oral histories, but the world largely doesn't listen. Small injustices ignored become blueprints for large ones. When international communities ignore atrocities in small countries, it signals to larger countries that they can get away with it too. Regional solidarity must mean something more than protecting dictators from consequences. And here I want to think about Tanzania's last election. The East African compatriots or other presidents have gone ahead to congratulate Madam Samia Suluhu Hassan. Despite seeing all the atrocities, despite seeing the lack of transparency, despite everyone else calling that election a sham, they still congratulated her, and sent representatives to the inauguration. Think about that. Today, if you visit Malabo, the capital of Equatorial Guinea, you'll see modern buildings, shiny glass towers built with oil money, paved roads in the city center. It looks on the surface like a success story, but underneath, one of the worst human rights records in Africa. No free press whatsoever, no independent judiciary, opposition leaders regularly imprisoned or disappeared, a ruling family that's looted billions in oil wealth, 76% poverty rates despite high per capita GDP on paper. Norway created a sovereign wealth fund worth about 1.7 trillion. Every Norwegian benefits free healthcare, free education, amazing infrastructure. Equatorial Guinea, the Obiang family became billionaires while most citizens remain desperately poor. The difference: institutions, transparency, accountability, democracy. And Black Beach Prison, still operating, still holding political prisoners, still a place of torture and death. Equatorial Guinea went from one dictator to another. The Macías, the nightmare ended, but dictatorship, again, like I said, never ended. There's a generation of young people in Equatorial Guinea today, people in their 30s and 40s who grew up during Macías years. Many never learned to read because schools were closed during their childhood. You can't get those years back. That damage is permanent. And there's a new generation, teenagers, young adults who've grown under Obiang. They've never known anything but dictatorship. Their parents lived under Macías. They're now living under Obiang. 2 generations of dictatorship. 56 years if you count from independence in 1968. That's an entire lifetime. All right. Let's talk about what Francisco Macías Nguema's nightmare teaches us. Because this isn't ancient history. This happened within living memory. And the patterns are repeating right now. First, mental health matters in leadership. Macías was clearly clinically mentally ill, paranoid delusions, psychotic episodes, erratic, bizarre behavior, all documented before he took power. But there were no mechanisms to evaluate fitness for office, no psychological assessments, no way to prevent someone clearly unstable from gaining power. Now, I'm not saying we should require mental health screening for all politicians. That could be abused. But when politicians show signs of severe instability or extreme paranoia or bizarre conspiracy theories or completely erratic decision-making, violent rhetoric that escalates beyond political norms, that's not entertainment. That's not just politics. That's a warning. When leaders claim everyone is plotting against them, when they see enemies everywhere, when their behavior becomes increasingly unpredictable and extreme, when they isolate themselves and trust only family and ethnic kin, pay attention to those patterns, because Macías showed all of them and everyone ignored the warnings. Secondly, anti-intellectualism literally kills. All East African countries have made enormous strides in education since independence. Kenya's literacy rate is about 82%. Tanzania, about 78%. Those are real achievements, generations of investment in education. But recently, in both countries, there's been concerning rhetoric. Politicians mocking universities as graduates out of touch, or politicians deciding that they do not have enough money to pay for free education. Stop that. And stop it immediately, because that is how it starts. It starts with rhetoric. The educated elites. We don't have enough funding. We don't need all these experts. It ends with closed schools and murdered professors. Macías closed all schools. All schools. He banned the word intellectual. He systematically killed anyone with an education. That didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, starting with anti-intellectual rhetoric that made people think education was suspicious, that expertise was elitism. Those members of parliament that pride themselves that I did not do well in school, that, I am a leader from God. Those are the leaders that we should be very wary of. When you hear politicians attacking scientists and researchers, or university professors, doctors, healthcare, journalists, experts, investigate those reports. They're not attacking elites. They're attacking the people who might check their power with facts and expertise. Recently, the expert said, as reported by Kengen, that our power was enough, that in our highest peak we had about 2.4 megawatts that were being utilized, and there was no load shedding. But on the other side of the country, in Qatar, the president claimed that we didn't know that there was load shedding. He questioned the educated, the intellectuals, the people that actually run these institutions, and said and proclaimed that in Kenya, between the hours of 5 and 10 in the evening, we have load shedding because we do not have enough, contradicting what his own intellectuals were saying. Kenya has 55 million people. Equatorial Guinea had 300,000. You might think this could never happen here. We are too big, too visible. The world would intervene. No, they wouldn't. Remember Rwanda in 1994? 800,000 people murdered in 100 days. The world watched. The UN pulled out. Nobody intervened until it was over. Darfur, Tigray, Myanmar, Syria, the international community doesn't reliably intervene to stop atrocities. Ever. Your protection isn't international attention. Your protection is strong institutions, vigilant citizens, and refusing to normalize tyranny. Lesson 4. Overthrowing a dictator doesn't automatically bring democracy. Equatorial Guinea overthrew Macías and got another dictator, one who's been in power for 45 years now. This pattern repeats across Africa. Ethiopia overthrew Mengistu, got decades of EPRDF authoritarianism. Uganda overthrew Idi Amin, eventually got Museveni, 39 years and counting. Zimbabwe overthrew Mugabe, but Mwanaganga, basically Mugabe 2.0. Breaking from tyranny requires more than just removing a person. It requires rebuilding institutions that prevent the next person from becoming a tyrant. It requires constitutionalism, rule of law, independent judiciary, free press, civil societies. Otherwise, you're just replacing one strong man with another one. Our 2010 constitution created excellent checks and balances. Defend them. Because the alternate is Equatorial Guinea. An eternal dictatorship, just with different faces. The international community will not save you. Let's just remember that. The UN didn't save Equatorial Guinea from Macías. The African Union, then the OAU, didn't save them. Spain, the former colonial power, didn't save them. Nobody saved them. They saved themselves eventually through an internal coup, but only after 50,000 to 80,000 people had already died. Don't count on intervention. Don't assume someone else will stop a dictator. Don't wait for international pressure. Your defense is strong democratic institutions. Alert, engaged citizens, independent media, functional opposition, rule of law. Build them, defend them, because nobody else will. And if there's anything to learn from this, just remember that the African Union congratulated Madam Samia Suluhu Hassan. Even after international communities called the whole election a sham, even after there was blood on the streets of Dar es Salaam and many other cities in Tanzania, the African Union congratulated the incumbent. And finally, and this might be the most important lesson, never ignore the warning signs. Macías showed every possible red flag before taking power. Traumatic, unstable childhood, history of corruption, bizarre behavior, documented psychological issues. Everyone saw the signs. Nobody stopped him. Today, when you see politicians who show extreme paranoia, who have no respect for institutions, who promote anti-intellectual rhetoric, who use increasingly violent language and isolate themselves from criticism, rely exclusively on ethnic or family loyalty, show erratic and unpredictable behavior. Don't laugh at it. Don't laugh it off. Don't think it would never happen here, because people in Equatorial Guinea thought that too. When you see the likes of members of parliament saying that they would have murdered 5,000 Gen Z if they were in power, if you see governors galvanizing their position and bringing out weaponizing young people to go and fight peaceful protesters, don't think that that is normal. Stop it. Call it out. Be brave. Exercise extreme vigilance and strengthen institutions. Bring them to book. Francisco Macías Nguema killed between 50,000 and 80,000 people. He closed every school in the country. He turned Black Beach prison into a torture chamber where prisoners dug their own graves to cheerful pop music. He destroyed an entire nation so completely that it still hasn't recovered 45 years later. And most people have never heard of him. That's the real tragedy here. Not just what happened, but that it's been forgotten. Because when we forget atrocities, when we let them fade from memory, when we do not study them and learn from them, then we guarantee they'll happen again. Here's why this episode matters so much for Kenya. For Tanzania, they just had an election, and incumbent won by 97.6% of the vote. The main opposition leader had been in prison since April on treason charges. The main opposition party had been banned from participating. There are credible reports of hundreds of people killed in post-election violence. Internet has been shut down. Opposition figures are disappearing. These are not normal democratic processes. These are authoritarian tactics. They are escalating. Macías started with arresting a few opposition figures. Within a year, he was murdering cabinet members. Within 5, it closed all schools. I'm not saying Tanzania is Equatorial Guinea in 1968. You're not there yet, but you're testing the waters. You're seeing what you can get away with. So stop. Stop now before it's too late. For us as Kenyans, we are not in Tanzania's position yet, and that's good. But we've got our own warning signs. Police brutality against protesters, extrajudicial killings, ethnic rhetorics in politics, attempts to undermine the judiciary, pressure on the media. These are all early warning signs. Early stages of what can become Macías level horror if left unchecked. We have something Equatorial Guinea never had. We have a functioning democratic institutions. We have civil society and we have independent media. Under pressure, but still existing. We have educated populations. We have regional integration. Use these advantages. Defend these institutions. Because once they're destroyed, getting them back takes generations. If you can get them back at all. This man closed all schools because he feared educated people. He killed anyone who would think critically. He destroyed an entire generation's future because intelligence threatened him. The world forgot about him. Don't let anyone repeat this playbook. Not in our countries. And don't let the world ever forget again. This has been the Kenyan Week that was. And I'm your host, DY. Join us next week as we dive deeper into another crazy African dictator. But as in the meanwhile, like I keep on saying, stay woke, stay vigilant, but above all, stay prepared to call out evil whenever you see it. Don't be washed through by the political rhetoric or by ethnic propagations by your leaders. Again, this has been DY and this is the Kenyan Week that was. Remember the forgotten. Learn from the past. Defend your future. Because patterns only stop when people refuse to let it continue. From me to you, to every other person watching, adios. Have yourself a lively, blessed day.